Okay, let's talk about arguments. They're very central to what we're going to be doing in this course. Usually when you think about the definition of an argument, you think about a disagreement between yourself and a friend or family member or a coworker. But the definition that we're going to use in this course is an attempt to support a claim with at least one other claim. And the claim or claims doing the supporting are called the premises. And the claim being supported is the conclusion. Okay, so here's a really short, simple argument. Let's say that my premise is that I live in Gilroy, thus I live in California. So the conclusion there is Ryan lives in California, supported by the premise that I live in Gilroy. So that's a simple, kind of throwaway, silly argument that works, but isn't very interesting. Here's another definition that you'll find in a lot of logic textbooks. An argument is a set of statements, some of which are offered in support of a conclusion. And of course, those statements that are offered or advanced in favor of the conclusion are the premises or the premise. You need to give at least one reason for the premise, for the conclusion rather, and but there's no limit of how many you can have, right? So you could have an argument with one premise, like the argument I just gave, or two, or three, or four, 10, 20, 30, 100. There's no theoretical limit to how many reasons you can offer, how many premises you can offer in favor of a conclusion. Here's another one. Jane lives in Florida, so Jane has seen a Florida license plate. Again, the conclusion there is about the license plate supported by the fact that Jane lives in Florida. So again, every argument has to have a conclusion and at least one premise. And in the first definition, we use the word claim. Conclusions and premises are claims, and in the second one, they're statements. So those are synonyms, and the definition of a statement or a claim, or as you can see, an assertion, is that it's a declarative sentence. So that means that it has to have a truth value. There are lots of sentences that we use that aren't claims, and they don't have truth values. All right, so you might want to pause and think of some examples of sentences like that. So here's some non-claims. Questions, or we sometimes call them interrogatives. For example, if you ask, what time is it? Commands, also known as imperatives, also do not have a truth value. Right? If I say take out the trash, or don't touch that, I'm not uttering something that's true or false. Now, it might be the case that the trash needs to be taken out, but that's different than the command of take it out. Right? You might take it out because of the fact or the claim that it needs to be taken out. And then there are lots of other sentences that aren't claims. Greetings are another example. But the main three that I want you to know about are questions, commands, and exclamations. So expressions of feelings like boo or oh boy. So again, none of these sentences carry with them truth values. Okay, so let's practice a little bit. So here's a little lesson from Charlie. Which Charlie am I talking about? Well, I think that'll become clear as we go through the exercise. So here are some sentences uttered by our friend Charlie, and you got to figure out if they are a declarative sentence, if they're a claim or not. I'm by winning. That's a claim. I win here and I win there. Also a claim. Now what? No, it's not. That's a question. If I'm bipolar, aren't there moments where a guy crashes in the corner? Oh my God, it's all my mom's fault? That's another question. Shut up, shut up. That's not a claim. That's either a command or an exclamation or both. Stop, move forward, and finally that's a command. So if you couldn't guess by this little rant here. Our friend Charlie is of course Charlie Sheen, and this is a little transcript from an interview that he gave when he was all over the news. Okay, so none of these things, questions, explanations, commands, are you going to see in arguments, none of those are going to be used as premises or as a conclusion. All right, here's another argument. Here's the first premise. If it's December 25th, it's Christmas. Premise 2, notice here we have two premises, it's not Christmas. So these two premises, they are both true, and their truth guarantees this conclusion. Therefore, it's not December 25th. Right? It's true that it's not Christmas as long as you're not watching this on Christmas, which I hope no one would ever be listening to. I mean, I would be very flattered, but hopefully you're not listening to these on Christmas. So it's true that it's not Christmas. It's also true that if it's December 25th, it is Christmas. And if both of those things are true, which they are, that guarantees that it can't be December 25th. Here's another one. Premise. It's February here in New York City. Conclusion, it probably won't be in the 80s. All right. Now, there are a lot of words that I've been using repeatedly now, like thus, therefore, because, and these words indicate whether or not there's a premise or a conclusion present. So let's start with words that indicate premises, premise indicators. So they signal a premise. Because was one. Since is another. Given that I live in Gilroy, therefore I live in California. This is implied by I live in Santa Clara County. This is implied by the premise that I live in Gilroy. This follows from the fact that Jane has seen a Florida license plate. This follows from the fact that she lives in Florida. And then here are some words that indicate or signal that a conclusion is nearby. Therefore and thus, we saw those. So is another common one. Hence, I live in Gilroy, hence I live in California. Jane lives in Florida. This entails that she has seen a Florida license plate. I live in Gilroy. It follows that I live in California, and this implies. Now, a question I often get from students is, what about if? Isn't if a premise indicator, or maybe it's a conclusion indicator? And it turns out that if can appear in front of premises and conclusions. Here's an example. If Ryan lives in Gilroy, then Ryan lives in Santa Clara County. Premise 2. If Ryan lives in Santa Clara County, then Ryan lives in California. And if both those things are true, then it must be true, this conclusion, which also starts with if Ryan lives in Gilroy, then Ryan lives in California. So if doesn't tell us very much. And there are other indicators, but these are the main ones that it would be good for you to know. Okay, let's talk about the evaluation of arguments. What makes them good or not? And there are really two things that I think are the most important when you're evaluating arguments. Number one is whether or not the premises are true. If you're going to show that an argument doesn't work, then one of the ways to do it is to show that one or more of the premises is false. Because if an argument doesn't have all true premises, then it can't be good. Okay, that's the first thing to think about when you're evaluating an argument. The second one is a little bit more complicated, and it has to do with something called the inference. Likewise, if the inference of the argument is bad, the argument can't be good. Well, what exactly is it should say inference there. What exactly is the inference? Well, first off, no, it is completely independent. It has nothing to do with whether or not the premises are actually true. You can have a good inference with false premises, true conclusion, false conclusion, false premises, true conclusion. So the truth value of the premises doesn't tell you very much about the inference. So how do you tell if it's any good? Well, here's a simple two-step procedure. Step 1, imagine that all the premises are true. If they're not, then imagine, well, what if they were true, right? So if your premise is, I live in California, okay, great, it's true. You don't have to imagine very much. But in the Jane argument, the premise was Jane lives in Florida. So that might be false. Maybe she doesn't. But to evaluate the inference, just imagine for the sake of argument that she does. So after you imagine they're all true, you have to ask yourself, does this mean that the conclusion is guaranteed or likely? And if the answer is yes, then the inference is good. If not, then it's bad. Okay, let's practice a little bit. Here's a premise. Ryan lives in Iraq. Therefore, he lives in the Middle East. So the argument overall isn't good because there's at least one false premise. There's only one premise, and it's false. I don't live in Iraq. I don't think I would enjoy that, especially right now. So the premise is false, the conclusion is false, but the inference is still good. Why? Because if you imagine that it were true that I live in Iraq, then it would guarantee that I live in the Middle East. Okay? Same thing with this argument. Ryan lives in Florida. That's false. But if you imagine that it were true, it would make it likely, not guaranteed, that I've seen a Florida license plate. So you might notice that these two arguments are a little bit different. The top one about the Middle East, the inference impeccably, perfectly gives a logical stamp of a guarantee to the conclusion, right? In other words, if the premise is true, then it is a matter of necessity that the conclusion has to be true. It necessarily follows. Okay? So that's one type of inference that we call deductive, and that'll come on the next slide. The second argument gives us an inductive inference, right? Me living in Florida doesn't make it necessarily true, doesn't guarantee I've seen a Florida license plate, but it makes it likely, right? Maybe I live in Florida and I'm blind, or maybe I'm a newborn child in a hospital and I'm not old enough to have seen a Florida license plate. But the inference is still good because of the probability that is established. Okay, so that should say two kinds of inferences, two kinds of arguments up there. And as I just said, if you have an argument like the Iraq one, where when you imagine the premises are true, it guarantees the conclusion, then you've got a deductive argument, and the inference is what we call valid. That's a very important term that we are going to use repeatedly through the course. So I'll say it again, valid. Valid means that when you imagine the premises are true, even if they're false, or even if they are true, in other words, if the premises are or were true, that logically guarantees the conclusion. If that's the case, then the argument is valid. And then we know it's deductive. But in the Jane argument, we're imagining that the premises are true. We're imagining Jane in Florida. It doesn't guarantee the conclusion, but it makes it likely. Likely but not guaranteed. In that case, the inference is strong, not valid, but strong, and the argument is inductive. And think about a terrible argument. Jane lives in Florida, therefore she speaks Chinese, right? That premise doesn't guarantee nor make it likely that Jane speaks Chinese. And if that's the case, it's not really clear if it's deductive or inductive, but at that point it doesn't really matter. So again, this argument is valid, but it doesn't have all true premises, so it's not a good argument overall. Remember, when we evaluate arguments, there are two things that are required: a good inference, and you need to have all true premises. So this one comes up short on account of the false premise. All right. So if you've got an argument that is either not valid or has a false premise, and here we have a false premise, then we say the argument is unsound. So what exactly is soundness? How does it relate to deduction? Well, here's the definition of soundness. An argument is sound if and only if it's valid and has all true premises. So the Iraq one is not sound because it's not valid, or invalid, as we'll say. It's invalid. It's unsound if and only if. So that IFF is just shorthand for if and only if it's invalid or has at least one premise. So the reason why I'm using that phrase if and only if is because it's a shorthand. Essentially, it's saying that we'll take the if and only if in the top bullet. It's saying if an argument's sound, then it's valid and has all true premises, and if it's valid and has all true premises, then it's sound, right? So sometimes if and only if is appropriate, sometimes it's not, right? Notice if I say someone is Clark Kent if and only if that someone is Superman, that would work, because if you're Clark Kent, then you're Superman, and if you're Superman, it's Clark Kent. If and only if tells you it goes both ways. But this doesn't always work, right? If I said that you are a San Francisco 49er if and only if you're in the NFL, that's false. That only goes one direction. While it's true that if you're a 49er, then you're in the NFL, the other direction is false. If you're in the NFL, it's not necessarily the case that you are a San Francisco 49er. So that's what that phrase, if and only if, means. And here's the definition of deduction. An argument is deductive if and only if it's intended to be valid. In other words, it's deductive if and only if it attempts to logically guarantee or provide absolute support for a claim, as we saw in the Iraq argument. I live in Iraq, and that is supposed to provide absolute support for the fact that I live in the Middle East. But in the Jane argument, it wasn't going for absolute support, right? When you say she lived in Florida, so she's seen a Florida license plate, you weren't trying to guarantee that, you were just trying to show that it was likely. So that's why it's inductive. Right? This is different. So this argument, it's not valid, it's invalid, but it's strong. Okay, let's evaluate it in terms of whether or not it's any good. Well, it doesn't have all true premises. I don't live in Florida, so overall it's not good. And if it's an inductive argument that's not good, we say that it is not cogent. So there's a parallel between strength and validity, in other words, between strong and valid, and there's a parallel between sound and cogent. Valid and sound go hand in hand with deduction, and cogent and strong go hand in hand with induction. Now there's a little bit of crossover because we use the term invalid to apply to this inductive argument, and we can stipulate that all inductive arguments by definition are going to be invalid. But loosely you want to associate sound, valid with deduction, and cogent, strong with induction. So here are a few more definitions. An argument is cogent. What that means is that it's strong and has all true premises. So notice, for any sort of good argument, it has to have all true premises and it has to have a good inference. In other words, it's strong or valid. So it's not cogent if and only if it's not strong. In other words, it's weak, we'll say, or has at least one false premise. And it's inductive if and only if it's intended to be strong, or it's going for probability. Right? It's trying to show that the odds of the conclusion are established to a degree, in other words, a probability of something greater than 50%, but less than 100, because 100 would mean that it's valid. inductive arguments at best provide, and it should say, probabilistic support, not absolute. All right. So feel free to pause this presentation at any point and go back and listen again until you really get it. That's what's great is I can kind of go a little bit fast because you can stop at any point and replay anything. So let's talk a little bit more about validity because I said it's such an important concept to this class that I want to look at several other definitions. So here's a definition. An argument is valid if and only if its premises, if they are or were true, logically guarantee the conclusion. So in the Iraq argument, I don't live, the premises are actually false, but if they were true, if you imagine that I live there, it would guarantee the conclusion that I live in the Middle East. Here's another definition. An argument is valid if and only if it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. This is a very popular definition for validity. You'll see it in a lot of logic textbooks. But I didn't include it first because it is a little, I think when you first read it, it's a little bit harder to follow than the other definitions I've given you. But they all are saying the same thing, right? Think about the Iraq argument. It's valid. Because, think about this, is it possible to live in Iraq and not live in the Middle East? No. So it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. And here's one more definition. An argument is valid if and only if the conclusion logically follows from the premises. Right? I live in Santa Clara County. That follows from the fact that I live in Gilroy, right? Maybe I don't actually live in Gilroy, but if I did, then it would guarantee I live in Santa Clara County. Living in Santa Clara County would logically follow from those premises. So again, the inference, whether or not it's strong or valid, has nothing to do with the actual truth values of the premises. Okay, so that was a lot of material, but that was a week and a half's worth. So let that digest, replay it as much as you need. But let's do a little bit of application. I said that we were going to apply a lot of this theory to real life, and this is still sort of a theoretical example, but it's sort of a fun one. So I call this example Joe the Married Bachelor. You might say, well, that's weird. Married bachelor something's wrong about that. Bachelors aren't married. And you're right. There's something contradictory or inconsistent about this description. And so I tried to search the internet for an example of a married bachelor, and this is the best thing I could come up with. So there's Tiger Woods. He was married to the model, I'm forgetting her name, but certainly acted at least like a bachelor. So it's actually logically impossible to be a married bachelor, but this is the closest thing that we have. So I wanted to show you how sometimes, whether or not a conclusion logically follows, it's not obvious. Okay, in virtue of being a human being, you have the capacity for reason, and that capacity is going to give you intuitions about whether or not arguments work in terms of their inferences, whether or not they're valid. But sometimes your reasoning will give you the wrong answer. Sometimes it will lead you astray. Sometimes the correct answer is not the answer that you would think is correct. And this is one of those cases. And what we're going to eventually do is I'm going to teach you a system to check your intuition or your guess. You're presented with arguments all the time in your discussions with other people and what you read and what you watch. And usually you just use your logical capacity to evaluate those arguments. But what you're going to gain in this course is a formal method for checking that guess. Or if you don't have a guess at all, to give you the answer. So here is a very strange argument. One premise, one conclusion. The premise is that my friend Joe is a married bachelor. And the conclusion is, therefore, God exists. So the question is this argument valid? Not is it sound. It can't be sound because the premise can't be true. But does the conclusion logically follow from the premise? So our intuition, our guess, is going to be, of course, no, right? How could the existence of a married bachelor prove that God exists? But it turns out, so that's our intuition. But if you knew the formal procedure, which I'm going to teach you, it would give you the correct answer. And the correct answer in this case is that, yes, this conclusion does follow from the premise. It's very counterintuitive, very strange. But the existence of God, and really the existence of anything, can be established by an inconsistency or a contradiction, in this case, the married bachelor. So let me show you why the conclusion follows. Why it's the case that if we've got a married bachelor, that necessarily God exists. Okay, let's start with this question. Let's say that Joe really is a married bachelor, right? Remember, the first step in checking for validity is to imagine that the premise is true, right? So it's difficult because this is a contradiction, but let's just stipulate that it is true that Joe is a married bachelor. If that's the case, then what do we know? If Joe's a married bachelor, well then, of course, we know that Joe is married, right? If Joe's a married bachelor, he has to be married. That follows, right? No problem there. That logical step should sit okay with you. Okay, here's another step that works in terms of the logic, but it might not be obvious on its face. So it turns out that if Joe is married, that the following statement must be true. That Joe is married or God exists. Now you might think that's a bit strange, but if you think about what or means, it's not strange at all. Let's say I make a promise to you that if you pass the class, then I'm going to reward you with either cake or ice cream. Okay? And then you pass the class, and I reward you with ice cream. So I bring no cake, but I bring ice cream. Did I keep my promise? Of course I did. Okay, let's say that I brought cake, but no ice cream. In that case, I also kept my promise. So with an or statement, as long as one of the two parts is true, the whole thing is true. So this or statement with Joe and God is true because at least one of the parts is true, right? Like in the cake and ice cream example, I brought, say, the ice cream, and the statement, I'll bring cake or ice cream, is true in virtue of the fact that I brought one of them. So the or statement with Joe being married and God existing is true because at least one of the parts is true. Well, which part? Well, namely, the fact that Joe is married. So it is the case that if Joe is married, it necessarily follows that either Joe is married or God exists. Right? It's sort of a strange deduction or derivation, but there's nothing illogical about it. Right? I mean, take your name. Let's say your name is Sally, right? So isn't it true that your name is Sally or Susan? My name is Ryan, but isn't it also true that my name is Ryan or Todd? So this or statement here is just a little bit strange because there doesn't seem to be any sort of connection between the parts of either side of the or, but they don't need to be connected, right? So I could say, my name is Ryan, therefore either my name is Ryan or God exists. That's true. Okay, that was the only difficult inference of this argument. Now we're home free. Okay? So again, we start with the premise. My friend Joe is a married bachelor. If that's true, if we imagine that's true, then we know that Joe is married. We also know Joe is married or God exists. Well, if Joe is a married bachelor, what else do we know? Well, we know that he's not married. Why? Well, because he's a bachelor. Right? If Joe is a married bachelor, we simultaneously know that he's married because he's a married bachelor, and we know that he's not married because he's a bachelor. So now look at the last two bullet points, and you'll see that the conclusion is inescapable. If it's the case that either Joe is married or God exists, and we know that Joe is not married, well, then God must exist, right? Whenever you have an or statement, you're saying A or B. If you rule out one of them, then the other one has to be true. So we've ruled out that Joe is married because he's a bachelor. And if he's married or God exists, then it must be the case that God exists. Okay, so again, the argument as a whole, you might think we cheated or something, but again, the argument as a whole, it's not any good because the premise is false. It's actually necessarily false, which means that it could never be true. So it's not a sound argument. It's not a good argument, but what's interesting is that the reason why it's not good is not on account of the logic. The logic is impeccable. The logic is fine. The reasoning is correct. And we're going to learn a technique for determining whether or not reasoning is correct. We're not going to do it right away. We'll do that when we study deduction. We'll do a lot of other things before then, but that is one of the main points of this class. Okay, so just to kind of give you a review with some questions about the content and the material here, let's ask some important questions. To see if you really understand validity, let's start by answering this. Can a valid argument have all false premises? What do you think? So maybe pause and think about that. And the answer is sure. Think about the Iraq argument. It's got a false premise. Ryan lives in Iraq. Therefore, he lives in the Middle East. It's valid, but has a false premise. There's only one, so they're all false. How about this question? Let's say I tell you that an argument has a false conclusion. What, if anything, do you know about its validity? Do you know that it's automatically valid or automatically not valid? So pause and think about that. Well, the answer is we don't know anything about its validity, right? You can have arguments with false conclusions that are valid, like the Iraq argument. I don't live in the Middle East. That conclusion certainly is false, but it's valid. And you can, of course, have arguments that are not valid with false conclusion, right? You could say, premise, the moon is made of cheese, therefore Lady Gaga is an alien. Everything about that argument is false, and it's not valid. Now, as practice, why don't you try on your own, write a valid argument with false premises and a true conclusion. Valid argument with false premises and a true conclusion. So maybe pause and try that. Okay, how about this one? Ryan lives in Florida. That's a false premise. Therefore, Ryan lives in the United States. The conclusion is true, right? If living in the United States validly follows from the fact that I live in Florida, but the premise is false. So the argument overall is unsound because I don't live in Florida, but the logic is there. It's correct. And then try this. Write a valid argument with all false premises and a false conclusion. Well, the Lady Gaga argument is an example. Oh, no, I misspoke. No, it's not because that is not valid. The Iraq argument is one like that. Right? Or I keep using that one. Let me give you another example. Ryan lives in China. Therefore, Ryan lives in Asia. Right? I don't live in China. It's false I live in Asia, but the argument's valid. Okay, if I tell you an argument is invalid and it has a true conclusion, what do you know about the premises? So it's invalid and it has a true conclusion. Does that mean that the premises must be true, you might think? Could they be false? Well, it turns out that we don't know anything about the premises. Right? Here's an invalid argument that has a true conclusion and true premises. You might say, that's weird. Everything about it's true, but it's invalid? Sure. Right? Ryan lives in California. That's true. Premise. Therefore, Ryan is male. Both of those are true, but there's no connection. So sometimes I think about the inference or validity in this case as a bridge, right? Or the glue. And if it's valid, it's super glue, and if it's strong, it's Elmer's glue. Right? So both of those statements are true. I live in California, I'm male, but there's no bridge between them, and that's why it's invalid. And you certainly can have an invalid argument with a true conclusion with false premises. Right? So take the conclusion that I live in California and false premises. Lady Gaga's an alien. That argument's invalid, right? It doesn't, because she's an alien, that doesn't guarantee I live in California. It's a true conclusion. It's invalid, but the premises are false. So we don't know anything. The premises could be true, they could be false. Why don't you try to write an invalid argument with true premises? Okay, an example of that might be that there's all sorts of ways to go here. The largest ocean in the world is the Pacific Ocean. Therefore, the smallest ocean must be the Atlantic. Right? So you start with the true premises, but there's no bridge there, so it certainly is invalid. Can an invalid argument have true premises and a true conclusion? Now you might be tempted to say no. Right? If you've got true premises and a true conclusion, it can't be invalid. But the answer is yes. Right? I think I gave an example. Ryan lives in California, therefore Ryan is male. Everything about that argument is true, but there's no bridge, so it's invalid. And finally, if an argument has true premises and a false conclusion, what do you know about its validity? So you might think the answer is nothing because that's been the answer so many times, but here we do know something about the argument's validity. If you've got true premises and a false conclusion, the argument by definition has to be invalid, right? Because a valid argument means that if you start with true premises, the conclusion is necessarily true. So that means that you can never have true premises and a false conclusion. It's impossible, right? That's the definition. That's one of the definitions. An argument is valid if and only if it's impossible to have true premises and a false conclusion. So if an argument has that, if it is possible, then by definition, it's invalid. Okay, I know that was a lot, but feel free to pause at any time, go back, replay things, and if anything is confusing, feel free to email me or come talk to me in person. Okay, that's it for this lecture. I'll see you, quote unquote, at the next one.